Almost the script for a Western showdown movie. On the same week that United Conservative leader Jason Kenney was sworn in as Alberta's latest premier, he picked multiple fights. He's threatening the federal government with a constitutional challenge over what he calls the No More Pipelines bill that would overhaul the environmental assessment program and process for a natural resource. He promises to fight against the government's carbon tax, even after the Court of Appeal in Saskatchewan ruled that the government does have the jurisdiction to impose one on the provinces. Then Jason Kenney threatened to, quote, turn off the taps, cutting off oil to British Columbia, a province that already seen gas prices as high as $1.70 a litre, if Premier Horgan does anything to prevent the Trans Mountain pipeline to be built. Is this just tough talk, or will Premier Kenney follow through on his threats? Is he stoking the coals of Western alienation? BC's Green Party leader, Andrew Weaver, by the way, who holds the balance of power in the NDP government there, is here to respond to that. And Mr. Weaver, always a pleasure to welcome you to Question Period. What do you make, first of all, of Premier Kenney's threats to turn off the taps to your province?
Yeah, it's just bluster. Bluster, and it serves well in an election campaign where you're trying to, stoke support for the poor, downtrodden people that you are claiming you're going to pull out of poverty and bring them to prosperity and wealth, and everyone will have unicorns in their backyard. That may well work in an election campaign, but he's now a government, and we as Canadians deserve a far less bluster and far more thoughtful discussions. Look, he can't do it constitutionally. Number one, that he would expose Albertans to the mother of all liabilities from the people of BC for any damages that occurred. He knows that. His advisors know that. The British Columbia knows that. That's why we're in court immediately to say this law is unconstitutional. It's worse than that, though, because it would immediately create problems under NAFTA, because the Trans Mountain pipeline only about half of the stuff comes to BC. The rest goes to the U.S., to the Cherry Point refineries. He would then trigger a NAFTA challenge, which would bring more liability on Albertans. And then there's the oil companies, who actually enter into contracts with refiners and others, and who have to deliver into those contracts, and he would basically undermine their ability to do so and would open a liability with them.
All right, but Andrew Weaver, hang on. Let's say he decides to follow through with it. He doesn't like the process for the Trans Mountain, and he said, go ahead, take me to court. I run on this. I'm not afraid of this. He knows that he's got the backing, by the way, to cut off the taps of Saskatchewan Premier Scott Moe. Could BC, or would BC actually retaliate while this wends its way through the courts?
Well, first off, Mr. Moe is probably hurting a little bit now, because his bluster has been his bluster bubble has been popped as well through the Supreme Court decision that quite clearly pointed out federal jurisdiction is there to be able to enable carbon pricing in provincial jurisdiction. So again, more bluster. The reality is that cooler heads will prevail, because Canadians want it to prevail. I think the whole bluster that's happening is actually backfiring, and it's quite remarkable to see the level of uptake, for example, of electric vehicles, of hybrids, the push to build transport in this province, and that is a direct consequence of the high gas prices.
Andrew Weaver, you mentioned this Saskatchewan Court of Appeal that ruled 3-2 in favor of the government, that they do have the jurisdiction to impose the carbon tax. Okay. What does that do to this fight over the carbon tax? You still have Ontario, Manitoba, Saskatchewan, and Ontario saying, I don't care, we'll take this to the Supreme Court. The fight is hardly over. What's your view?
Well, this will go to the Supreme Court of Canada then. And again, we'll expect a decision there. The sad thing is, I think most British, we know in every single riding in the country of Canada, people want our elected leaders to deal with the issue of climate change. They're looking at the news. They're watching what's going on in the Ottawa, Gatineau, and New Brunswick area. Remember the forest fires in BC. It seems to me that Mr. Kenney seems to have forgotten the forest fires that plagued his province recently. We know the cause of that. We know that increasing greenhouse gases is causing warming. We know the result in terms of extreme precipitation, floods, and fires. We know it's going to get an awful lot worse, and we know that Canadians want elected leaders to do something. So they can continue down their path, but again, it's bluster. We should actually be recognizing that the environment, the climate system, frankly, issues like poverty as well, they don't know what political party you belong to. They want our elected leaders to actually roll up their sleeves, get on with it, and actually deal with these issues. And bluster does not help.
All right, you keep saying bluster, but look, the courts now ruled that the federal government has jurisdiction on the carbon tax issue. Yes. But the courts may also rule that the federal government has jurisdiction to build the Trans Mountain Pipeline. So can you have it both ways? You want to respect the courts on the carbon tax? Great. Also, should you then stop your fight and respect the courts that the federal government has jurisdiction to have a pipeline, the Trans Mountain Pipeline, and end that fight?
The British Columbia government asked the question, a test case, is it possible for the province, it believes it does, to regulate that which crosses its boundary because the province is on the hook for any cleanup? It's not saying about whether a pipeline should be built or not. It's questioning through a test case whether diluted bitumen, it can regulate what is in the pipeline. The province is not saying you can't ship refined fuel to BC. The province is saying we're very concerned, profoundly concerned about the increasing export of diluted bitumen on our coastline because of the environmental concerns about a spill when it happens. People in Kalamazoo would probably be behind us there saying, we understand your concerns. And so again, I just wish that we would have a more thoughtful discussion about this because, you know, on the one hand, Mr. Ford and Mr. Kenney, Mr. Ford is not a climate change denier. He has said publicly that things are going on and we need to deal with it. Well, so what are you going to do, Mr. Ford? That's the question Canadians should be asking. Mr. Kenney, what are you going to do? And frankly, bluster and pivoting to the world is 6,000 years old is not going to deal with the problems that we have before us. And I think Canadians are wanting our elected leaders to work together to solve these. And that's what we're committed to do here in BC. And we're demonstrating that by two parties who have a long history of not working together, of working together to ensure that we put people first and public policy first in the province of British Columbia. It's tough. It's a lot tougher, but you got to put your ego aside and you got to actually work for people as opposed for your own political career.
All right, I got to leave it there. A Green Party leader in British Columbia who holds the balance of power out there, Andrew Weaver, great to have you on the program.